I just want to give you a little bit of a brief introduction. In addition to being a professor at John Jay College, I'm also part of Measures for Justice, and my personal background before I became an academic was I was a private investigator and I worked solely on indigent defense work. So I have some experience in this area and know what it means to not have the information you need at any given moment. So my talk today is entitled Telling Your Story, but telling your story with data. Data is our friend, right? It gives us tremendous power, and without it, we have very little to go on. We have intuition and we have belief. So the problem when you add effects to a slideshow is sometimes you add it too thoroughly. Measures for Justice is an organization that was started in 2001, and it was based on on the founder's experience in the criminal justice system and a book called Ordinary Injustice, where Amy Bach, traveled around the nation and saw justice being administered in court, or how America holds court. And from that, she determined accurately that we had very little information across the nation about how justice is actually administered. You know in this room, and it's a joy for me to see this because I've been saying this for years and years, justice doesn't happen at the state, it happens at the local level, it happens in counties, right? That's where justice is administered. And most of the measures we have about the functioning of the justice system are top-heavy. They come from states, they're aggregates, right? And they don't give us the picture. I'm intimately familiar with New York City data. I can tell you when we talk about things like incarceration rates, we're really talking about New York City, not New York State, because 70% of our prison population comes from New York City, right? Texas has a particular set of challenges because you have large metropolitan counties and then you have very, very small counties, right? And without understanding that variation across a state and how justice works, there's not a lot we can do. What we want to do with creating Measures for Justice is creating indices that can help counties work together, all right, in administering some of the most profoundly important justice activity, right? When people come to court. You see people in court at their worst hour, right? And I'm just going to give you, these are some of the discussion items for today. I'll give you a little bit of a background of Measures for Justice. I've sort of done that. The development of an index process, right? We've talked about what it means to have indices that are not from my gut, right? But are practice-based, things that we understand from research and study and what happens in the real world, or the way justice is administered not from how we wish it were or how we think it is, but how it actually is. Let's just see. So, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of what we've learned from the field. We've been partnering with some counties on collecting data and what that looks like. And then I want to also talk to you about what we can demonstrate from the nation at large or counties across the United States. So this is the genesis of Measures for Justice. We measure everything in the United States, right? We have a consumer price index. There's nothing that happens in the United States that we don't measure, from the Atlas health indicators, Business Week school rankings, but we don't measure justice, right? More Americans are involved in the criminal justice system than in any other time in our history, and we're talking about roughly 65 million people have a criminal record, right? So these are not unmeaningful. And the question then becomes, why haven't we done this for criminal justice or the justice system? There are a couple of things to remember. The criminal justice system is just that. It's a system, right? And each part of the system works together. And if you don't know the whole system, you don't know how it's actually working, right? So in the criminal justice system, there are a number of issues that we have to sort of work through to try to create these measures that we can utilize to assess how well we are delivering justice. We have system legacy issues. That's both in the, sort of the world of the geek where I live, where you've got information systems that don't communicate well with each other. You have data being collected from a variety of agencies who are collecting data for their purposes, and then we try to hobble it together for other purposes. So if I'm counting how, if I'm counting hours that an attorney is working on a case, the first thing I have to do is define what a case is. That seems simple. Then there are sort of cultural legacy issues that we don't really address in the criminal justice system, where Party A and Party B don't communicate with each other and therefore won't share data, right? The big issue for us, I think, is that we have stakeholders with a variety of what we think are competing interests, but they're really not, right? The more transparent we are and the more the data, and this is something that Andrea Marsh talked about earlier this morning, the more the data or the people with the data communicate with one another, the better we are at all aspects of the system. So getting back to what is a case, in Texas, I understand that you measure a case in a very rational way by person indictment, right? But across the nation, that's not the only way a case is measured. Cases are measured in a variety of different ways. Cases are measured within the same state in different counties in different ways, and in the same county, different agencies will measure a case. So if we want to look at things like caseloads, which we've spent a great deal of time today talking about, we've got to first define what we mean by a case. I'm a social scientist by training, so there's book after book written called "What is a Case?" Right? And this becomes a critically important issue because without a case, you can't say how are our resources deployed? How long should we be working on a case? In Texas, I understand that you have a fairly sophisticated and pretty wonderful system where you can count the number of new cases assigned to counsel, but it's hard to know how many open cases are still in the docket. This is a slide that we've collected from what's publicly available data. There are publicly available data. And let's just talk about this for a little bit because this is an estimate. And I use that term very generously when I say estimate. The data is collected from information available at ICPSR, and it's an approximation of caseload comparison between prosecutors and public defenders, right? Now, in a perfect system, you would see equal amounts of resources on both sides of this graph, right? And I want to talk to you a little bit about why this graph is terrible. Or what's wrong with these data, I think is a better way to think about it. We started with the largest counties in the United States with populations of 100,000 and more. By the time we hobbled together with bailing wire all the available data on this topic, we ended up with 50 counties. The first thing that we learned is there's a great deal of variation across the United States on what caseload information looks like, right? Because of how we've collected these data, this is what is available, right? We didn't do anything, this is what we could get. It's hard to make statements about what the causal relationships are here, but we can certainly say there's a lot of variation in how different organizations assign cases, right? It would be very helpful for us all to know what caseloads actually look like, which it seems soon you'll be able to answer, at least for here. So this brings us to what our mission is. And for Measures for Justice, we want to identify the correct systematic deficiencies, right? It's one thing to identify a problem, but you have to identify the right problem, right? This seems simple. And our mandate is to create a monitoring method to lower criminal justice system that will gauge how well or poorly any particular system is doing, right? And we want to do this on an ongoing basis, right? And most importantly, we want to leverage the data for change and make that data available so everybody who is a stakeholder in the system can utilize that data to do what we do better, right? And I think that's really important. None of this is I got you, right? This is a way that counties who have very good practices, have best practices, we can use those counties as models, right? And certainly best practices may look differently in large urban counties and small rural counties, but we don't know what they are yet because we don't collect that information, right? So we want to enhance public safety. We think with good data you can enhance public safety if people know what we're doing. Senator Ellis spoke very eloquently about what happens when we convict someone incorrectly, when we have an innocent person in jail, not only is that person, has their liberty been removed, but the person who in fact was responsible is free, right? And we want to protect the rights of everyone before the court, right? This is crucial and important, and we want to improve courts' fiscal responsibility. Not only is not collecting data problematic conceptually because we don't know what it's doing, it costs us money, right? And so just to think a little bit about how an index might look, the first thing we need to do is identify the right measures. It's great to collect measures, but they have to be the right measures, right? Not only do the measures have to be the right measures to get at what you're trying to understand, we have to use them correctly. All of us have seen data used badly or incorrectly, right? And they have to be available to the people who need them, right? It can't be complicated to get the data. It has to be easy. The delivery system has to be there immediately. Recently, I found an old friend, and I wanted to know that they were doing, and I Googled them, and the next thing I knew is they had a small business with 3 employees, right? I work with capital punishment data all the time. Most of the time, I can't tell how many homicides there actually are in the nation, and when I do get it, it's 3 years old, right? If businesses can tell me that someone has 3 employees in a small store in New Jersey, surely we can do better than that when it comes to criminal justice data. Right? So creating an index involves having people who know what they're doing, and here are some of our general goals and what our guiding principles are. It needs to be comparable. We have to be able to compare what's happening in Austin to what's happening in New York or in New Jersey or some other county, right? This happens all the time where you take on data that are not comparable and you try to make comparisons between places, and it's a problem. They have to be operational. It has to be actionable, right? And it has to be simple. And it has to be transparent, right? Here's our data council, just because everyone loves pictures. We've assembled a group of people who have experience and expertise in a variety of aspects of the justice system and in research, right? Because our goal is to have the best possible measures, not the measures any of us individually like, right? And besides my passport photo, which you all now have, you can see me with my niece. Right? Right. So, and once you have performance indicators, you have to do something with them. So what are the right measures? How do we identify them? We want to improve public welfare, prevent wrongful convictions. Wrongful convictions are tremendously costly to the system, tremendously costly to the individuals, and there's no greater challenge to the notion of democracy than wrongfully convicting somebody. And optimize fiscal responsibility. So this increases what we're trying to focus on is access to justice, timeliness of the process, right? Transparency, the due process, fairness and accuracy, public safety, independence and accountability in the legal proceedings, right? And budgetary concerns, right? Now, we all know that the criminal justice is a system, and our goal is to have measures, which we've been slowly developing and piloting, on every aspect of the criminal justice system. What happens at arrest and what happens at arraignment, when counsel is appointed, when counsel first sees the defendant. These are all crucial elements to a just system, right? We've heard talk earlier today about what happens when you don't have an attorney during a plea negotiation. We all know that the vast majority of all criminal cases in the United States are disposed of with a plea, right? There are consequences to taking that plea. Sometimes your clients know what that is, sometimes they don't, and sometimes the plea offer isn't even presented to them. So having an attorney at this part of the process becomes one element that we need to be able to measure, right? So if we go through the system, we can see that at every stage of this, there's data that are important to collect to be able to understand both how that part of the system is working, but how that part of the system is working with the rest of the system, right? Is the data that the police are gathering from their arrest records, which we count, right? We use arrests, we use clearance rates as a way to measure how the police are doing, but is that information translated into other parts of the system, right? I want to show you some things that we've done and talk a little bit about other things. I can talk to you a little bit about what we've learned from our pilot studies, which are really quite fascinating. But I want to give you some idea of what we're doing. The matrices that we collect have to ensure desirable outcomes, right? And part of that is the discussion is what do we mean by an outcome, right? What is an outcome? Well, an outcome might be that you had an attorney with you during the plea process and you got the best possible plea available. It also might be that your case is dismissed because it was a weak case to begin with, right? And these are all parts of what we have to do, but each of these outcomes has to be part of a holistic system, right? Provide rationale and data to support new resources. This is really kind of important. The more we have information, the more we know where we need to invest in the system, and we know what parts of the system are working well and producing the results that we want, right? We can use these data when we think about the external opportunities for counties that are working with us. It improves the judicial system overall, and we start to build bridges between different aspects of the criminal justice system, and we've seen some really positive results from this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but if you go, these are all part of how you use your data to leverage information to build partnerships within your own working group, but then across counties within the same state, right? And you can learn from, counties can learn from one another what works best in each of those counties. Right? Here's some more data that we've cobbled together with Baling Wire. This is, I think, one of the most profound graphs that you can look at to look at how the system is functioning. The dark lines, and I'm told I have a, right? This is the proportion of defendants who have been granted bail who are still in custody because they're unable to make bail. Right? In many places, the vast majority of people that are held in pretrial custody are there because they can't make bail, not because bail has been denied. Right? And if you think about how the system relates to these, relates to each of these stages of processing, it becomes really obvious. If you had an attorney during a bail hearing, your bail hearing would look quite different, or might. Right? The next darker bar are people who are in custody because bail has been denied. What's shocking about this is that the majority, in most places, the majority of people who are held pretrial in custody are there not because we've determined them to be dangerous, but because they can't pay their bail. Right? They just can't pay bail. This is extraordinarily costly and inefficient. Earlier speakers today talked about, and I don't want to spend a lot of time belaboring it, talked about the importance of being out preparing for your defense, right? And if you're in jail not because you've been determined to be either dangerous or a flight risk, but just simply because you don't, and bail amounts are modest by most standards, right? What many people would think of as modest, but for many people, they're insurmountable. And then as you go through the graph, I'm sorry about this, right? These are people who have, and these are people who have been released on their own recognizances. The far right, you've been released on your own recognizance, right? So a very simple thing, and again, the most important thing to notice here is how different we are across the nation, right? I'm in the business of statistics, and we like to talk about what are, mean-driven activities. We can't really tell what an appropriate matrix would look on how many people should be held in custody, right? But we can certainly tell that close to 70% is not a good idea, right? Okay. Here is looking at the time to release for felony defendants pending trial. And again, you see very stark differences. The light graph is the median time, where roughly half of defendants are, it's the midpoint in the data, where half of the cases are above and half of the cases are below. So, and then the dark graph is the average, right? And you can see in some places in Jefferson, Alabama, people are released within 24 hours, right? Which is not so bad. And then if you go to the high end, you see that people are there for 2 months, right? A simple statistic like this of how long you're holding your defendants prior to trial is, right, enlightening to say the least, and how different it is across the nation, right? And then lastly, bail amounts, right? These are average and median bail amounts. Notice that Los Angeles has extraordinarily high bail amounts, and I don't want to criticize Los Angeles per se. And then places like Contra Costa, California, have very low bail amounts. These are in the same state, right? LA has a bail schedule, and it's a very strict bail schedule that they follow with vigor, it seems, right? Right. So if we're looking at bail and we're talking about fairly modest amounts on the low end of the scale and significantly high amounts at the high end of the scale, we've now gotten a lot of information about a very simple practice about whether or not the defendant is out and able to participate in their own defense. We think that using these kinds of data will help us create a set of indexes that will allow us to measure a justice system and create matrices that will help the justice system function better, right? Which is what the fundamental goal is. Some of the things that we've learned, if I told you in one jurisdiction that less than 1% of all felony filings have a discovery motion, right? You might be horrified and wonder what the defense attorneys are doing in that jurisdiction. And that's a data point, and it's one data point. But if I also told you that in that same jurisdiction, the prosecuting attorney has an open file policy, right? So when we're coming up with measurements, we have to think about how the system works together, right? Because rather than having bad public defenders in this jurisdiction, they have a prosecutor who's committed to a fair and transparent process. You can have counties in the same state where closer to 80% of the felony cases have filings for discovery, right? Which is an indication that they're perhaps not getting the discovery motions that they need. It could also mean that it's part of the practice of the office that you file discovery motions. So when we're thinking, and I use this to illustrate that when we're thinking about what data we need to collect, we have to think about it as it relates to the system as a whole, and will it help us make a better justice system, and what other components of it do we need, right? And that's really, because without those three elements, what we have done is collected a data point, right? And data points are nice for making memes, but they're not so good, right, for making a system functional, right? And so what I want to leave you with is that when we do this work, when we actually collect the data, and when the data when the data can talk to itself, and when the people who are responsible for the data can speak to each other, you end up with a system that has greater fiscal responsibility, is more transparent, and less likely to have very egregious miscarriages of justice, right? Where you don't have defendants languishing in jail for years before they get before the court. And thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored to have been here.